Over time, I find myself loving Xenoblade more and more. I'm not totally sure what it is. They have worlds that are really easy to get sucked into, both in terms of story and having big, sprawling environments that are filled with things to do. And above everything else, they're actually fun to replay. Long games can be really iffy to come back to because of the time commitment they require, but it almost feels like you learn something new in each playthrough, and that makes another go a good time. Xenoblade 3 is coming out soon when I'm writing this, and I can basically guarantee you that I'm going to be cutting myself off from society until I finish it. Hell, I was excited for it before it was even confirmed to exist. I went back and played Xenosaga Episode 1 last year and really liked that game too. The actual announcement of it made me go back and play the other Xenosaga games, and the only time I came close to dropping a game in this series was because of this stupid boss in Xenosaga 2. Like, who is this woman, and why is she making me cry so much? But it was all worth it in the end, because I somehow ended up playing the 30-hour game that is Xenosaga Episode 3 in like 6 days. I haven't been able to do that in a while, especially now with an old game, and I wasn't even done with it. I instantly went on the Xenosaga wiki to look up lore so I could actually comprehend what I just played. If Monolith can't legally tell me the rest, the best I can do is try to piece it together. Despite all that, I still wasn't satisfied. My Xeno brainrot needed more. I could replay Xenoblade X, but you know, maybe a better use of my time would be to play the only Xeno game I haven't played yet, Xenogears. That was not a jab at Xenoblade Chronicles X. Please play Xenoblade Chronicles X. Where is the Switch port? It's actually kind of funny how things work out. Xenoblade is a Nintendo IP, but the Xeno games were only on PlayStation before, and they still are to this day because Squeenix and Namco are allergic to re-releasing games that didn't do well. Namco, I swear to God, please learn from Klonoa. I did end up playing Xenogears on PS3 though, but that was mainly just because the shadows during fights didn't work right in Duck Station. I knew it was gonna bother me the whole game, and yes, I am that petty, at least when it comes to review footage. Even with the game looking worse, the footage still came in at 143 gigabytes, so maybe that was the right call. I shudder to imagine what native 1080p footage would have taken up. My only gripe was that it kept screwing out my capture card somehow and would randomly freeze with no warning. The game played fine, but recording from PS3 is a massive pain in the ass. Please re-release this game. I didn't really know much about Xenogears going in, other than Xenoblade 3 is apparently oddly similar in plot. And after watching the intro, yeah, two countries starting with K and A are at war and features a main protagonist with black hair and a ponytail. They're practically the same game. Jokes aside though, I always wanted to try out Xenogears, and I was planning on looking at these games at some point, so what better time than now, right? The saga begins with... Wait, wrong game. Anyway, there's this war going on between two countries, Ava and Kislev, and it's been happening for so long no one remembers why it started. Eventually, this religious organization called the Ethos found these powerful mechs called Gears in some ruins, and the basis of war completely changed. You can't just fight on foot anymore, you need fancy killer mechs. Kislev had the upper hand due to having better RNG in the rune finds, but another country called Ignis helped out Ava, only to stab them in the back later and take over their capital and all the land they just conquered because of Ignis. War. But you'd be forgiven for not remembering any of this backstory because it's explained completely through text without any kind of visuals. Yeah, it turns out Sonic Forces just ripped off Xenogears. And it's not even important right now because it then cuts to Faye, our JRPG protagonist of the week. He's been living in the outskirts of Ava and Mahan for as long as he can remember, which is only like 3 years. The dude's got amnesia. All he remembers is his name and that his dad was a pretty important dude. It's the day before his friend's wedding. Timothy and Alice here are gonna have a long, happy life together. Isn't that nice? Alice asks Faye to borrow a camera from the dock up in the mountains. His name is Satan. Ketan? Setan? Saitan? I don't know. Point is, they have Faye over for dinner only for the village to get attacked by gear pilots on the way back. Faye and Satan seemingly help everyone to safety, and then Faye gets into a gear that's been abandoned by his pilot, and he, for some reason, already knows how to operate it. He fights off the invaders, at least until one of them shoots Timothy, which makes Faye go crazy and destroy the village and half the people in it, including all his friends and loved ones. Okay, so for those who don't know, Xenogears was the original pitch for Final Fantasy VII, but they turned it down for Final Fantasy because they thought the premise was too dark. They were right. Faye loses consciousness and doesn't even remember what happened upon waking up. Alice's younger brother Dan is unsurprisingly pissed, and Faye gets exiled from the village. Well, kind of. It's more of a, it's gonna be real awkward having everyone to hang around the guy or destroy the village kind of thing, less of an angry mom with pitchforks situation. After Faye leaves, he meets a girl holding him at gunpoint, and he somehow already knows her name is Ellie. He explains the situation to her, and she basically calls Faye a coward for pushing the blame toward the soldiers that attacked the village, even though she was the reason why they were there in the first place. She does apologize for it later, but not before she almost gets eaten by a dinosaur and Faye has to save her in the mech from the village. Afterwards, she has to talk with Satan about all all this, and figured it'd probably be best if she just leaves while Faye's asleep. Ellie does make up with Faye later and actually joins the party eventually, but not for a while, and not before lots of character development for both of them. Because they're on opposite sides of that war from the intro, and Ellie doesn't have it in her to actually hurt Faye, so she has to take some performance-enhancing / brainwashing drugs to fight him. And I know it's supposed to be this big emotional moment, but when I saw this dialogue portrait, this was all I could think of.
Ellie, please call me your little pog champ.
No, you're not my little pog champ. You're not even based. You're cringe.
My sense of humor has been completely destroyed, help me. And when she does join the party, it's only after a bunch of fighting, conflict, and saving the prison down that Faye was put in after we went crazy again. And despite the game starting so dark, it doesn't get anywhere close to that again. The plot kinda does what it wants for the most part. After wandering around the desert for a bit, Faye meets a band of pirates led by a guy named Bard, who's actually the heir to the country's throne, but they're taken over by the Hrggg. And Faye actually doesn't want to help him out at first. He doesn't want to fight, he just wants a place where he can be left alone in peace. But he does eventually join up when he realizes he can use his power to try and prevent what happened to Lahan from happening somewhere else. Then he goes crazy again and gets sent to prison and has to escape through a surprisingly detailed fighting minigame. You see what I mean? This game's all over the place. There's even one point where Faye gets beat up by this Ramses dude that has a massive hate boner toward him, and they play protagonist hot potato for a while. It goes from Ellie to Billy to Satan, and one thing leads to another where you run around some lab, and the antagonists get their hands on a living colony of nanomachines. Like, this game loves to use the nanomachine excuse after a while. Hideo Kojima probably loves this game. Honestly, I think the one thing I don't like about the plot for most of the game is that there isn't any kind of end goal in mind. There are goals they work toward, like rescuing Morty or getting Bart's palace back, but Faye almost feels like some dude coming along for the ride for the most part. For a good chunk of the game, he doesn't even feel like the main character. You can look at a lot of similar stories, and the protagonist has some kind of goal they're working toward. Keeping the peace, finding some grand treasure, rescuing a princess, something. Xenogears doesn't have anything like that for a good 70% of the game. Things just kinda happen and you see where it goes, if that makes any sense. There isn't even a sense of trying to stop the bad guys either. Antagonists do exist in the story, but they're pretty infrequent for most of it, and even trying to describe who any of them are is a massive spoiler. You don't know what they're trying to do for most of the game, so it's hard to even work around that in terms of having an end goal for yourself. I've heard people call this game one of the best stories ever written, and while I wasn't expecting it to be like that, it isn't quite that good. Don't type angry comments yet. Or do, I won't complain about free algorithm juice. Xenogears' story is really damn good, despite how I'm making it sound. It's just really hard to describe on a macro level. If you ask me what the game's about, I honestly have a hard time answering it. There's a lot of layers, a lot of things going on at once. When I go over game stories and that sort of thing, I try to write it like I was telling a friend about it. Like Sonic Adventure 2 is a game where Sonic gets arrested, proves his innocence, and later has to stop a space station from crashing into the planet. Isn't that neat? With Xenogears, the best I can do is Faye accidentally destroys his home village, wanders around a bit, and it somehow ends up escalating and fighting God. Just like any RPG. Look, I did really enjoy this story, even the moment-to-moment story. Just, you know, it gets deep, and talking about it in any kind of depth past the bare essentials gets complicated. Ultimately, if you've played Xenosaga or Xenoblade and like those stories, you'll probably like Xenogears' story. I know it sounds like I'm spoiling the whole game here, but that was mostly only a third of the game, and even then, I still skipped over a lot of it. Xenogears has a lot of story and cutscenes, way more than PS1 RPGs had at the time. PS1 RPGs had plenty of cutscenes, don't get me wrong, but never this much. There's often points where there's a good 30 minutes to an hour where you're just sitting around reading text, and this isn't just once in a blue moon, it's pretty frequent. It's a good story too, a damn good one. Just, you know, be prepared to do a lot of reading at points, and honestly, the text is probably my only big issue with the story until the second disc. I did complain about Faye not really being the focus for most of it, or how there's no real end goal to work toward, but those are things that I can forgive. What I can't forgive is this text speed. You can't fast forward through it. You can't make the text faster. You can't even skip cutscenes. So if you die during a fight with a bunch of cutscenes beforehand, you have to rewatch them every time. It almost looks like they picked the text speed based on the on-foot battles, which run at 60 FPS, but the game only runs at 30 FPS outside of that, often less when you're fighting in Gears, so you usually deal with a slow normal speed instead of the much more comfortable speed here. It just makes me more irritated about how slow this text is. Granted, the game's pretty easy for the most part, but there were a few times where I had to sit through this slow-ass text scrolling before I was allowed to play the video game again. I don't mind that I died and have to try again, it's just sitting there mashing the X button for a good 5 to 10 minutes that I hated. But at the very least, the only fight I died to more than twice was the final boss, and I had the decency to only have a minute-long cutscene beforehand and tell you how it works. Just, you know, let me make the text speed faster, that's not much to ask. And speaking of issues, the FMVs are pretty inconsistent. They're fairly frequent near the beginning of the game, but they stop showing up after about the first 10 hours, only to show up again in the second disc. So I end up going like 20 to 30 hours in between seeing a single one, and then they show up a lot more often. The game usually goes for in-game cutscenes instead, which I don't mind. They use a lot of cool cinematic angles during cutscenes. The 3D environments gave them a lot more freedom for how they wanted to present everything. It's not just an overhead view over a pre-rendered background. I don't know what it is about 2D sprites in a 3D environment, I just love this aesthetic. You can even rotate the camera, that's really cool for a game like this from this era. Just because they had this fancy new tech, that doesn't mean there weren't advantages of doing things the good old-fashioned way. And honestly, the infrequency of full motion videos just make it come off like they had to meet some quota set up by Square. Like you weren't a real RPG back then unless you had them. The actual quality of the FMVs are fine though. It uses both anime scenes and CG scenes, which feels pretty unique. Games usually only stuck to one or the other. The opening scene even uses both at once. Some people like to rag on 2D animation that uses some 3D for background elements, but I feel like a movie or something with 2D characters but a 3D background would look pretty cool if done right. The voice acting is oddly decent too. Nothing amazing, but I was shocked at how passable it was. But they don't even try to sync up the voice acting with the animation. It's really distracting.
I'm sorry. I guess I couldn't help you after all.
And I should stress the localization is generally good otherwise, but every now and then there's some weird phrasing that slips through the cracks. My father? You mean my dad? Alright, well that's probably all I got to say about the story until the spoilers section, so let's get to the gameplay. Regular battles are fairly self-explanatory. When you decide to attack, you have action points to make combos with. Light attacks use 1 point, heavy attacks use 2, and fierce attacks use 3. You get more AP as you progress through the game, which lets you do more damage. At first, you mainly just press buttons randomly, but you eventually get access to death blows. There's specific button combos that have a fancy animation and do more damage than normal. And as you try out different combos, you learn progressively more powerful death blows. And all the AP you don't use on your turn gets put into an AP gauge. Once you've stockpiled a bunch of AP, you can use them to do a bunch of death blows in one turn. But it's not overly useful because if you intentionally use less attacks, you're going to be doing the same amount of damage anyway. And bosses will go down just from regular combat before you get a chance to take advantage of it. I like that it's an option, but that combo command will only really get to be used like once or twice. You've also got Ether, or magic attacks. It depends on the character, but you probably won't be using it much. Even the characters that are meant to have a lot of Ether just do more damage with death blows. And that doesn't even use EP. But I do like how the Ether command is different depending on the character. Like Faye gets Chi, Satan gets Arcane, and Maria has controls. Because it's not Ether attacks, she's just sending out a giant killer robot to fight for her. It's a nice touch. The on-foot battles have a really fun, simple system, and you have to press the button combos yourself, almost like a turn-based fighting game, which makes you feel more involved than just selecting commands from a menu. The turn order is based on how fast the turn bar fills up too, so you can't always predict who's going to be going next, but just keeps you on your toes. I just wish that some of the animations going to be faster. Now that the fights are slow, I just feel like I'm sitting around watching animations a little too much sometimes. I was surprised at how fast the battles are too. RPG fights didn't have this kind of kinetic energy Xenogears has. You'll even store the fight in different locations on the battle screen just for some visual variety. There's only one major issue I have with the battle system though. How you learn death blows is not explained at all. I noticed some later party members had more options than the earlier one, so I figured I was doing something wrong. Then I looked up a guide on how to actually learn them, and I still didn't get it. And I'm not kidding when I say this, but I didn't figure out how death blow experience actually worked until near the end of the first disc. So, you know, only like 40 hours into the game, here's how they actually work, as far as I know. If you look on the status screen for each character, the skill menu shows the death blows you're able to learn right now. And if you input the right button combo for it, you gain experience toward that death blow and all the ones above it. Once you get the experience to 100 and you're a high enough level for it, then you learn the death blow. It doesn't sound too bad, but here's my problem with it. The only tutorial that tells you how this works is back in the starting town that you can't go back to after the game's intro, and you likely won't have any death blows until after you leave. Because they aren't clear on how death blows are learned, there isn't much indication that trying out new combos does anything. So you just end up spamming your most powerful attack all the time because it gets you better results, but that unknowingly ends up screwing you over in the long run. If I could redo this system, it would work like this. Once it gets the level requirement for a death blow, you're told that the potential for a new move grew inside you or something. And that death blow shows up on the status screen with an unknown button combo. And once you press the right combination, then you learn it without having to grind for it. It would still reward you for trying trying out new combos, but not be so cryptic that you don't know how you're learning new attacks. And if you didn't get the memo, then you can just look them up and not miss out on much. With the current system, you miss out on a lot of attacks if you don't know what you're doing. Unless you follow a guide, you won't learn them, and you're gonna have to grind for them. But luckily, you don't have to go out of your way to do that. I never felt that I was doing too little damage. And if you worry about the game being grindy, don't be. I never needed to and didn't have too much trouble aside from the final boss. And even then, I just needed to find the right strategy. The death blow thing isn't too big of a deal, honestly. It's just a really weird design choice and otherwise fun battle system. Yeah, it wouldn't be a Xeno game without some essential gameplay mechanic they don't bother explaining. Of how enjoyable fighting is on foot, fighting inside Gears is significantly less interesting. Death blows work differently for Gears. They already have most of them unlocked, but in order to activate them, you need to build up your power level by attacking without using a death blow. You get light death blows at level 1, heavy at level 2, and fierce at level 3. It seems different enough to be interesting, but it really isn't. The stronger ones take multiple turns to build up, and by the time you build up to your level 3 or even your level 2, you probably could have done about the same damage with a few level 1 blows. Like, I mainly only use the level 1s throughout the whole game, and I never felt like I was doing too little damage until literally the final boss. And that's mainly why gear battles were boring to me. You barely have any options. At least with on-foot fights, you could use different attacks or hell, items. But spamming your level 1 attacks is what you're doing 95% of the time. Some characters get special attacks that use fuel, but you only really have to use them on the tougher fights. You can also use fuel to give yourself haste, which can absolutely save your ass in boss fights, but again, it's the clear best thing to do a lot of the time. It's not really strategy. You can't even heal without using up one of your 3 part slots. I know I keep saying that you spam the same move until you win, but that's really what it boils down to. And they come with this really stupid fuel mechanic. Every attack you use uses up fuel, and if you run out of fuel, you have to use charge to slowly gain it back. You can't take too much damage either, because the only way to heal your gears is to use fuel, so it's really easy to be suddenly low on gas and have no way to immediately fill it back up. There are a decent number of heal points, but you will constantly worry about it the whole time. You won't straight up run out of fuel very often, which makes me question why it needs to be a mechanic in the first place. And why are there so many commands that use fuel? Why can't they just use EP like everything else? Gears can sure as hell boost ether attacks, but they can't improve healing magic in order to self-repair? Come on. Look, I know that the ethos control the supply line of gears, so you have to pay up to repair these things, but do I really need to be reminded of the waking nightmare of late-stage capitalism in my game about fighting god and anime mechs? Speaking of money though, gears don't gain experience, so we have to spend money to improve them instead. Again, you're not going to need to grind for it unless you want to. You can make absolutely broken setups by the end of the game if you got the cash, but there's no point. As for the game outside of fighting, it's mostly pretty linear. You go from town to town, and you really don't backtrack much. Hell, there's only 2 or 3 points in the whole game where it lets you explore instead of it being on a linear path, and one of them is right at the end of the game. But I should clarify, this isn't a big deal. There's barely any side quests to do off the beaten path. Its structure is linear, but it does take advantage of it. It's focused more on the storytelling, not so much exploration. There are dungeons, at least, and they would be pretty unnoteworthy if not for the random encounters. Like, good god, I really don't mind random encounters, but the encounter rate in this game is atrocious. Any place with complicated layouts becomes a complete pain. There's these sewers you have to go through, and it's the worst place imaginable. You know that RPG trope where you're trying to figure out a puzzle and lose track of what you're doing because of random encounters interrupting you? This is about as close as you can get to that in this game. Everywhere looks the same and navigation becomes a nightmare because as soon as you kind of figure out where you are, you get a random encounter and get lost again. And that's before we get into the annoying enemies of this place that confuse you or have a ton of health and just generally feel like they're there to waste your time. This place goes on for what feels like an eternity too. It felt like at least 2 hours of this garbage. I had a massive sigh of relief when I finally got out of this damn place. Babel Tower is just as bad, because platforming in an RPG, and triangle is the jump button, but square is the menu. It took me practically the whole game to get used to that. Jumping is nice for shortcuts, but having a whole dungeon based around platforming is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And yes, random encounters do get in the way of jumping. You can tell when you're about to get into a fight, because while it's loading, you can't jump. So, if you're about to make a jump, there's a good chance that you just fell off instead. So in a game with all these issues and a jump button that controls like an afterthought, Babel Tower is just a bad time. It's at least a cool location, but I swear they specifically designed it to be as irritating as possible to navigate. And if I'm making the average dungeon in this game sound bad, those are just a few outliers. Most dungeons are fine. It's just that at best, they're your average generic linear RPG dungeons. Not much to really say about them. The same can be said about most party members, at least gameplay-wise. Like, they all have their own development or story going on, but half of them are only plot relevant for like one story arc. Faye, Ellie, Bart, and Satan are all pretty well fleshed out, but everyone else just feels like a side character. I honestly forgot Rico was in the game after a while, but again, they feel mostly samey gameplay-wise. Because that whole either menu is useless most of the time, you use death blows instead, and most characters do about the same amount of damage. Even Ellie and Emeralda, who have a lot of ether attacks at their disposal, those attacks do less damage than death blows, so you don't have much reason to use them most of the time, unless you need to hit a whole bunch of enemies at once. Once you get more diversity in your party, I had a hard time trying to find a reason why I would use one party member over another. Why use Bart over Rico when they serve the same role and do about the same amount of damage? And that applies to almost the whole party. I'm not exaggerating when I say that when on foot, Faye, Satan, and Billy is objectively the best composition, because you will quickly realize that Faye and Satan are noticeably faster than everyone else, and because they get more turns, they do a lot more damage. There are these speed shoes you can get in the endgame that give the wearer auto haste, but why give it to one of your slower members when you can just give the super fast Satan even more turns? Billy will be a lot slower, but his attacks are so powerful that it doesn't matter much, and he's the only one with a group heal move. Billy's whole shtick is that he does a lot of damage, but you have to worry about ammo because he fights using guns. Yeah, he's a healer priest that fights with guns. That's something ripped straight out of Bloodborne, and I'm all for it. Or Virginia, I can't tell. But despite supposedly needing to worry about ammo, you have so much of it that I question why they even made it a mechanic. So yeah, you ride this combo as much as you can and the game has no challenge, at least on foot. Characters at least feel a little different when piloting their gears, but honestly, you just replace Billy with Maria and it's the same story. It just makes you not want to experiment with different party members. Each party combo feels similar enough to not make a huge difference. Maria and Choo Choo are the only ones that feel more unique. They don't have death blows and do abysmal physical damage, so they have to rely on ether attacks to do anything. Maria is obscenely overpowered when you first get her. Her ether costs are pretty high, but you get an accessory in literally the same dungeon she joins that halves EP cost. So you give her that and she just obliterates everything she comes in contact with. You'd think that running out of EP would be an issue, but Omega Souls are so cheap that you can just pop one of those outside of battle and have no consequences. No joke, during this enemy formation, the win condition was Maria getting a single turn to kill everyone in one shot. Does this look like the face of mercy? Maria is the ultimate glass cannon. Either she kills everything in one turn or she dies before she gets a chance to move. There isn't much in between in using her. She does lose steam after a bit, but her gear is consistently one of the strongest in the game. You will be carried by her. Choo Choo by comparison is so useless that I barely used her. I think she's supposed to be the healing support character, but this isn't the kind of gamer you need one. Billy's group heal move is more than enough. Instead of a gear, she makes herself giant and doesn't have to worry about fuel, which is neat. But everyone else does so much more damage that it isn't worth using one of your party slots on her. But this doesn't matter too much because the game is oddly restrictive on what party members you can use. The party often gets split up, so you just have to roll with what the game gives you. The first chance to even change your party is like 20 hours in, and when you actually do get to choose who to bring with you, the process is needlessly cumbersome. In most RPGs, you can swap from a save point or hell, just the pause menu. But in Xenogears, you have to talk to Margie, who's usually inside the ship. So if you're in a dungeon and want to switch up your playstyle or something, you have to walk all the way out of the dungeon, go back to the ship, go downstairs, wait for it to shut up, change your party, and walk all the way back to where you were before. And during this whole thing, you have to deal with PS1 load times on top of that. Even when you're on the world map, this process can take like 2 or 3 minutes when it takes 10 seconds in any other game. Near the end of the first disc, these green save points let you switch your party, but like, why didn't they just use this the entire game? And Faye is stupidly required to be in the party 95% of the time. Even the parts where you're exploring with not much story currently happening, there's 1 or 2 points in the game where he's absent, so why does he need to be here? The combat clearly functions without him. He's one of the better party members, sure, but I don't see why I have to use him when the game says you can't use him for a few hours. It just limits your options in a game that already limits your options. And it's those same lack of options that make the game feel like it's dragging on after a while. Gameplay-wise, nothing really changes. You might know different death blows, but you're still doing the same things in fights. It doesn't matter whether you're on foot or in gears. Xenogears doesn't introduce any new mechanics throughout the game. There's few bosses that make you think on your toes and change up your strategy. Most party members feel the same. It just gets old. You can only make this gameplay interesting for so long. You've got to spice things up to keep things fresh. But it doesn't. By the end of the first disc, the gameplay got stale. And it doesn't help that the first disc ends with this 5-hour story arc where you can't change your party members or go anywhere else or do anything else. It was at this point where I was mainly in it for the story and almost wanted to watch the rest of the cutscenes on YouTube. It's not that I didn't like the gameplay or anything, but when it comes to a game like this, it gets boring when it goes on for too long. Maybe it could have used more distractions like that fighting minigame from earlier, or some more interesting dungeons, you know, just something to mix things up. But in some monkey's paw twist of fate, I actually got what I wanted from the second disc, the too long didn't read version. Now, I'm not gonna go into spoilers just yet, but if you're interested in having played Xenogears, you really need to brace yourself for the second disc. The whole going from location to location structure has been completely nuked from orbit. Instead, the game practically becomes a visual novel. The developers were low on time and budget, so Square suggested they end the game after the escape from Solaris, but they weren't done telling their story and they were damn sure they were gonna finish it. So, this was their compromise. It's not totally devoid of gameplay. There's 2 or 3 short dungeons and a few boss fights, but it's like 80% cutscenes. And when the game does open up again, all that's left is the final boss and a few side quests. I have kind of mixed feelings about this, because on the one hand, this is all they could really do with time and budget and all that garbage, but on the other hand, if they were given the extra dev time to truly finish the game, Xenogears would have been way too long. This is an almost 60-hour game as is. The story content could have gone on for another 10 to 15 hours, and that would have made the repetitious gameplay way worse. This story almost feels too big for one game, and I do have to respect them for telling the rest of it any way they could instead of ending on a cliffhanger. But overall, I lean toward liking the second disc. I have no idea what kind of take that is, but it's how I felt. I was getting tired of playing the game, so it just gave me the fast version. And I know why a lot of people don't like it. It's like you're reading the plot summary of the game off a wiki instead of playing the game yourself. Even I agree that's not how the game should feel. It's not preferable per se, but I actually enjoyed how it was handled. And the story overall is just so big. Giving us all of it as originally envisioned would have been too much for my monkey brain to comprehend. I thought Xenoblade 2's story got complex at times, but no. That game's simple by comparison. Xenogears doesn't have the best story ever crafted by mortal hands or anything, but there's a lot of it. And I just keep thinking about it. There was a lot to unpack, and people are still analyzing this shit to this day. It resonated with people, which isn't easy to pull off. Xenogears has a lot of interesting ideas and concepts that I haven't really seen anything explore like this. It's a really interesting game to play not knowing what to expect from it, which is why I'm about to spoil a lot of it.
My dude, you are going to be attacked by the spoiler monster.
Alright, look, I've spoiled literally everything in videos before. You know, gone over every major plot point and event, kinda pseudo-analyzed them, I think. This is what Dark Dawn does to a man. I'm not about that this time. I am looking at a lot of the major stuff because I think it's genuinely interesting, but there's too much here. I mean, good god, I could probably make an entire video just about Faye's full backstory. I'm not joking. But for the most part, we can skip over everything until we get to Solaris, the last major area of the first disc. This place is really cool, but cool in the fictional sense. It's a dystopian society in the sky where the military and the rich and powerful live like kings, but the average citizen is a worker bee that lives their whole lives doing slave labor. Worker bee is what they're actually referred to. They even live in hexagonal cells and get, re-educated when they break the rules. Brainwashing. It's brainwashing. Or if they get too rambunctious, they just throw them away like the trash they see them as. Actual human beings actually being thrown away. Meanwhile, the incredibly racist rich people all have blonde hair and blue eyes, and if you don't, you're a social outcast, just like Ellie was. Surface dwellers are also called lambs and seen as subhuman for no other reason than them being the shepherds needing to control the lambs and all that fascist garbage. Solaris has also secretly been controlling everyone on the surface for God knows how long through the Ethos religion. Yeah, the religion that Belly's devoted his life to as a priest, all a lie to control people. Isn't that fun? Oh, and their priests raped orphans too. I love the part where you shoot their base with a giant laser. Most people on the surface don't even know this place exists, and they've somehow made their way into every corner of the planet. And to top the dystopia off, all their leaders have been alive for hundreds of years after uploading their subconscious into computers, and their ultimate goal is to revive God and explore the galaxy by themselves. Did I mention that they also see themselves as gods? Solaris would be terrifying in real life, and that's what makes it so interesting. It's not just this place either. The world of Xenogears is surprisingly well fleshed out with a lot of history. Like how Babel Tower is just a giant-ass spaceship sticking out of the ground, or how Ava has a whole block of the city devoted to prisoners to let everyone fend for themselves. This place is basically just Australia. The world feels incredibly fleshed out with interesting locations. Like, these guys actually took the time to think out a whole 10,000-year course of events for this planet, and they actually go into pretty decent detail about a lot of it. Jesus Christ, no wonder this game is so long. Also, there's a guy in Solaris that looks exactly like Timothy, and they just don't explain why. I figured he was a clone or something, but they just don't explain or bring it up ever again. What the hell? The boring explanation is that he was a distant relative or that one person in the war that's your total lookalike, but come on. There's gotta be something here. Which is when you think you've had enough of this place, you find out that Solaris also does genetic experiments on people and grind them up into food. To think that cannibalism is one of their tamer atrocities. Anyway, everyone tries to escape before running into Graf again. He's been kind of the main antagonist. Graf honestly isn't in the game that much, but he is there enough to where we know who he is. He won't leave Faye alone for some reason, and he seems to go crazy again whenever he shows up. So Faye goes crazy again, but this time right in front of everyone. As it turns out, Faye doesn't have amnesia. He has dissociative identity disorder, with his other personality going by id. I was actually surprised to see the game use the accepted medical term. I have no idea when this became the accepted term. I mainly just bring this up because Mega Man Star Force used split personality disorder, and I was really confused as an adult to find out the term changed. Also play Mega Man Star Force, I'm just saying. But before explaining Faye's childhood trauma, we have to get into the origins of mankind and fourth-dimensional beings. I'm not kidding. You think I'm kidding? You dare question Daddy Takahashi? Satan was a spy sent by Emperor Cain to watch over Faye because of how powerful it is. And the reason why it is so powerful is because Faye is what's known as the Contact, who has immense power drawn in from a fourth-dimensional being known as the Wave Existence who's trapped inside the Zohar. Something that should sound familiar if you played Xenosaga. Id can use his power so well because he was trained to be an assassin by the previous Contact. What is the Contact? Oh, you know, only the reincarnation of this kid named Abel that was able to talk to the existence inside the Zohar while looking for his mother that may or may not have died. I don't really know what happened to his mom. He was looking for her and then this happened. It's a whole thing. And the existence granted his wish by creating a woman with a mother's will. Why can it do this? Because the Zohar is seemingly as old as the universe itself and can generate an infinite amount of energy by connecting to a higher dimension. The Zohar is also controlled by a biocomputer that just decided to help out this random kid. Instead of using this infinite energy for something useful, it powers an interstellar weapon called Deus, which means God in Latin. They didn't even bother being subtle. This thing is a weapon of mass destruction, basically an artificial god. After making contact with Abel, Deus went crazy and killed a bunch of people. So they dismantled it and went to transport it somewhere else to figure out why it suddenly went GLaDOS on everyone's asses, but it went GLaDOS on everyone's asses again, which caused the ship to crash land into the unnamed planet Xenogears takes place on, with the only survivors being Abel and two clones of his mother, Elohim and Miang. And if you've only been half paying attention, Ellie is Elohim's reincarnation. The Contact has the power to destroy Deus in the Zohar, but only if Ellie, the anti-type, is still alive to inherit the Wave of Existence as well. Meanwhile, Miang is an agent of Deus whose sole purpose is to reawaken it. I don't know how to describe what she is. She's basically a virus, infecting her host with herself to become the dominant personality and stealing the life of whatever woman gets the misfortune of inheriting her. Also, they get purple hair for some reason. And every woman on this planet has the Miang gene inside of her ready to activate whenever the previous Miang dies. So basically, Abel and his mother are stuck in a reincarnation cycle until Deus is either revived or destroyed. His mother. Okay, their reincarnations aren't actually related to each other or anything, it's not incest. But if you told me that I was destined to be reincarnated many times over the course of 10,000 years and fall in love with a woman who looks exactly like my mother, I'd be creeped out, I'm not gonna lie. Okay, did you get all that? Because this is explained in Expedition Dumps pretty much all at once. I got the gist of it while playing, but I'm sure I forgot something in there. And even then, I still looked up info from the wiki in Perfect Works, so if you forgot something about this whole thing while playing, I can't blame you, everyone did. I have a bad habit of thinking about something else while reading and having to go back and reread the last paragraph or two, so I'm amazed I remember most of it. Anyway, the good stuff, childhood trauma. Against all the odds, Faye's mother just so happened to be Miang's latest host at the time. Realizing their son is likely to be the newest reincarnation in the Contact, she conducts a bunch of experiments against as well, and while bringing out his power, he ends up killing people in a beam of light. That's gonna mess up anyone, not to mention a 4-year-old. So Faye subconsciously makes a second personality in id to take all the trauma for him. Faye kept pleading to his dad not to let his mom take him away, but Dad, Khan, wouldn't listen. And honestly, it's hard to tell whether he was being a bad father or not. Khan does say he regrets it later, but this situation is so unlikely it would be hard to tell if Faye didn't like going out of the house or if something was actually happening. We've all pleaded not to go to school or the dentist or wherever. Your wife suddenly having a different personality when you're not around around is pretty hard to believe, especially from a 4-year-old. Oh, and Faye's mom is named Karen, because of course it is. But one day, Miang brought in Graf, who was the previous contact. Kind of. The last contact was named Lacan, who lived 500 years ago during the Solaris War. At least he's the last one as far as we know, but details. He attempted to make contact with the wave existence to gain their strength for the war, but because Sophia, Lacan's Ellie, died protecting him, the wave existence was unable to pass on their will and Lacan's awakening was imperfect, which caused Lacan's personality to split between him and Graf. Lacan's soul went on to be reincarnated as Faye, but Graf's soul lived on through possessing others. Graf wanted that sweet contact power for himself, but Faye's dad tried to stop him and failed, which caused Faye to go crazy and accidentally kill his mother. And it would have killed Faye if Karen hadn't somehow regained control of herself to shield him. But the trauma of killing his own mother just caused Id to take over for 10 years. Graf kidnapped Id and trained him to be an assassin while Faye's dad relentlessly tracked him down. He eventually did, Khan and Graf fought, and the trauma of being someone else for 10 years made Faye make a third personality without any prior memories, which is the Faye we've known throughout the game. But during their fight, Graf possessed Khan, so the guy who looks like a Darth Vader ripoff actually is the protagonist's father. But Khan has such a strong will that he's still able to break free of Graf's grasp. I can't say this. Why did I write this? And he disguises himself as Wise Man because he can't bear to show his face to his own son after all this. Basically, it took me 2 paragraphs to say this is significantly more interesting than a random-ass case of amnesia. RPG protagonists have had backstories before, obviously, but I've never seen one this deep. I just gave you the short version, that's before we end up Faye and Ellie's previous lives. Just looking at the brief excerpts of the previous lives, it really gives you a glimpse into the other time periods of this world. Kim's is a time mostly of peace, but also on the brink of destruction. Infertility is common, science is really advanced, politics are a mess, and it feels like all it takes is a crazy enough person in the right position to just end it all for everyone. It really feels similar to your own world. Aside from the infertility thing, unless mountains of crippling debt and a broken housing market counts as infertility, and then Lacan's time is an even worse mess. The world is in a never-ending war. Faye and Ellie can see into their past lives through dreams they usually don't remember, which is a really cool concept. And the whole Deus cycle between the Contact, Anti-Type, and Miang is just cool to think about in general. They took a lot of fantasy, religious ideas, and somehow spun them into sci-fi, which I haven't seen done much outside of the Xeno games. They wanted to turn this game into a whole franchise, and they really went all the way to try and make that happen. It's an interesting and fleshed out world with a lot of lore, all based around the idea that history repeats itself. At least it would be, if a good chunk of my understanding didn't come from my brain rot making me look at wiki articles and the perfect works just to soak in more of what I played. Because all of this meta stuff starts to become hard to follow when you're actually playing the game. Most of this is explained in like 2 or 3 lore dumps instead of gradually introducing concepts throughout. It doesn't give you time to process what's going on. It's like cramming for a test the night before. I could follow it at a surface level, but I missed a lot of things while playing, and that's just bad storytelling in my book. Not that the story is bad, it's just not told in the best way. A good example of the rushed storytelling is Emeralda's side quest near the end of the game. You wander around this old abandoned city, and it just so happens to be the city that Kim and his Ellie lived in. You get some more detail on them and how Ellie is really subconscious about not being able to bear children, which ended up giving Kim the idea to make a person out of nanomachines. What you're supposed to get out of it is that Emeralda finally accepted that her parents are long dead, which allows her to mature as a person, both metaphorically and literally. But it just leaves you confused about why this memory makes her randomly grow older. They don't clarify or allude to any of this in-game. There's a few parts like that, especially in Disc 2. Just due to the way the story had to be handled, some revelations and plot threads just don't hit like they should. Like, there's this whole part about people being mutated into looking like these deformed freaks of nature, but they're still human. They still have sentience. It raises a lot of questions about what a human being even is, but they have to skim over and move on before you get a chance to really think about it. But later on, when Ellie finally gets her Omnigear, she was the last one to get hers, so it should be this big moment, and you should feel a difference in how her gear plays, but it's just a cutscene. And like, look at this battlefield, it looks cool as hell. Everyone else has been kidnapped and it looks like they're being crucified. It's this amazingly cool backdrop, but I don't remember the context of this scene off the top of my head because of how much they have to leave out to get to this point. And there's one part where the party actually goes to the trash ship from the opening cutscene. I always love stuff like that, but there's no oh shit moment when you realize you've been exploring the ship from the beginning of the game. They just say, oh yeah, they go here at some point. Cool, right? Anyway, fight Turtle God. I've already said that I actually enjoyed how the second disc was handled, but it's really clear how much was lost from it. You don't have time to take anything in. The second disc is like trying to remember a drunk night in the town, and in this case, that's not good storytelling. It's better than not being able to tell it at all, but it's not nearly as good as it should be. The final boss is actually kind of cool though. You can either fight Deus directly or take on his helper satellites to make the fight easier. The idea is to use all your party members to avoid wearing yourself out. Once Faye gets his final gear, Chrono Cross, he becomes uber powerful, so you have to take advantage of that for the final fight. It's a really cool idea. Because the reality is that you don't have the cash to do this. Gear maintenance gets expensive near the end, so I mainly just stuck to Faye, Satan, and Maria. And fighting these extra bosses really isn't worth it. For sure, Deus has more attacks, but these guys have so much health that it's easier to take this guy head on. Because what sounds easier? Fighting 5 50,000 HP bosses in a row, or just one 75,000 HP boss? But even then, Deus is still hard. This is the one time in the whole game where I felt like I wasn't doing enough damage, because apparently there was a mechanic I had no idea existed. At the beginning of the second disc, Faye gets the ability to use its power temporarily, and you enter an infinity state where you do a ton of damage for 3 turns. What the game doesn't tell you is that this is the 4th power level, also known as Hyper Mode, and it's been there literally the entire game. If by the off chance you choose to keep your charge at level 3 and don't use any death blows, every turn there's a chance to enter Hyper Mode. The damage from Hyper Mode is insanely worth it, so you don't have much reason not to build it up. What makes Xenogears so massively good is that Faye now has a 99% chance to enter Hyper Mode, which makes him a total powerhouse. Using this newfound knowledge and power, I fought Deus up front. And I still lost. Horribly. Okay, so here's the actual cheese strat. Give Emeralda and Billy all the ether boosts you can. There's an accessory that doubles your ether attack at the cost of double the EP. This breaks the game on Billy. He has an attack where he shoots his dad at the enemy with a giant gun, and in using this one item, there's a good chance that the weaker version of this attack will always hit for the damage cap. So for 500 fuel, this dude deals almost 10,000 damage every turn. The church kid with the bowl cut has enough shots to solo the final boss. From there, have Emmy spammer ether attacks do like 3,000-ish damage along with them, and watch as Deus can't deal enough damage quick enough to kill anyone. So yeah, I killed God with the power of family and this gun I found. Like, when I was looking at tips for how to beat him, I was shocked at how easy this is to do. I didn't have to do anything other than shuffle around inventory. Each attempt before this was taking like 30-40 minutes on a good try. This fight lasted 6 minutes. You can grind to hell and back for completely broken gear setups, but why do that when this is so easy? Strategy is so much better than grinding. I could talk about the ending, but honestly, I don't know what happened. Deus is destroyed, so Xenogears is the only gear that still works since it doesn't need the Zohar for power. Faye has a conversation with Krellian about free will, they fight, and then Krellian just ascends to a higher plane of existence, I think. Also, I'm not completely sure who Krellian is. He basically just made a bunch of nanomachines to live 500 years and wanted to be a god or something. He's the main reason why Solaris' leaders were revived into a computer, but main plot-wise, I'm not sure what he really does. He's just kind of there for most of it. Not really evil or anything, he just has his own agenda. Also, he was in love with Sophia when she was like 13 or something, and he was like 10 years older than her, so like, not the best dude around. The day is saved and all that, but I don't really know how we got here. Destroying Deus is oddly anticlimactic. Nothing immediately happens aside from the gears no longer working. This is too big brain for me to comprehend. Someone crazier than me can analyze this. I got nothing. Oh yeah, Xenogears is actually meant to be the 5th game in a 6-part series, of which they only made one of. There were talks for a second game, but Square turned it down to focus more on their movie division. I haven't seen Advent Children, but whew, have I not heard good things about it. Strangely, I'm actually kind of glad this game never got a sequel. Now, don't take that the wrong way. If they made another game despite copyright hell, I'd be down. You know, assuming they actually go with the original plan and not something weird. Because we did get a rough idea of how the series was planned out with the Xenogears Perfect Works. Yeah, that is the actual cover. They didn't draw the nipples, but you can never be too careful on YouTube. Tatsu should be a suitable replacement. This book goes over basically everything they planned out, including lore, characters, art, a general sequence of events, the Zohar playing foosball with the timeline, just got it all really. I didn't read all of this thing, but I did go through about half of it. It starts with the general time frame where each episode takes place, and it's mainly events already covered in Xenogears. We actually already know the stories of episodes 2 through 5. Obviously, a game dedicated to each one would have elaborated in on a ton, but we really already know the gist of them just from this one game. Going into more depth might have felt redundant. Episode 1 and 6, though, we don't know much about. Episode 1 takes place 5,000 years before the Elders crashing, so it would be mostly unexplored territory. And Episode 6 would have been the final episode that takes place after Xenogears, which we know almost nothing about for obvious reasons. Those two I would have really liked to see, but the others I could live without. Episode 2 could have been interesting because we don't know a ton about the time of Genesis directly after the Elders crashing. It seems like it would have this really cool origins of mankind vibe going on, although humans exist in this universe and other planets, but still, could have been pretty cool. We already know the stories of episodes 3 and 4 in decent depth. 3 sounds like it would have been less gamey. It's about Kim's time, where humanity is at their technological peak and genetic defects cause a ton of infertility. There's a lot more room for story, politics, and just general existential dilemmas, but I'm not too sure how to get a decent amount of RPG gameplay from it. Doctors don't exactly go around beating people up, you know? Ironically, this could have made for a decent movie or miniseries. Episode 4 is about the Solaris War, which has plenty of potential as a game, but again, we already know most of it, so I'm not losing sleep over it. I already knew about this book before playing Xenogears, but I expected it to be mostly stuff we didn't know about. Looking through it, I was actually disappointed that it didn't go much outside of the game that was already there. And that's the thing, in an alternate universe where Xenogears was successful enough to fully make the perfect works as was originally envisioned, that means that we wouldn't have gotten Xenosaga and Xenoblade, and Tetsuya Takahashi would probably still be working at Square Enix, which means the Monolith Soft would have never been founded, which means Breath of the Wild would have never been finished in the form that we got. It's kinda crazy to think how a PS1 game not doing so hot dominoed into the Switch being a massive success. And if you like the other Xeno games, Xenogears retroactively makes you appreciate them more. They learn from their mistakes from this game, not only in gameplay, but also in storytelling. Xenosaga could get a little high concept at points, but the narrative was a lot more fully realized in Gears, despite not being finished. Also, Nephilim and Abel look exactly like Ellie and Faye respectively. The kid's name is Abel, they're not even trying to hide it. Are we just not gonna acknowledge this? No? Okay. With Xenoblade, they actually have a lot of similar ideas and themes throughout, like fighting a false god that wants to destroy humanity, the horrors of genetic experimentation, presenting the game as fantasy when it's really sci-fi. They really reiterated on a lot of ideas that Xenogears had, and often in better ways. It's hard to put what I liked about Xenogears into words. It's not a game I overly enjoyed playing, it's aged poorly in a lot of places, and at the end of the day, it's just unfinished. Despite saying a lot about it, it was hard to even figure out what I wanted to say. This game's been an experience, that's for sure. Xenogears is not a game I'd recommend to most people. It's long, the gameplay gets old, the random encounters are aggravating, and honestly, I'm probably never playing it again. But what's here, this weird-ass hacked-together PlayStation game, feels bigger than what it could have possibly been. There was ambition with Xenogears. They had a vision of what they wanted it to be, and it's hard not to respect it for that. I can see what they wanted to do, and they were so close. Had their development time been longer, had their budget been bigger, they could have achieved that. Maybe a port similar to the Final Fantasy PS1 games would help. Letting me speed up cutscenes and turn off random encounters would fix half the issues. It's actually funny. There's a plot point about this old painting that's clearly not done, people still liking it in spite of that. Because that's what this game is. Xenogears is an unfinished masterpiece. Despite its rushed development, it still resonated with me and plenty others. People are still analyzing its themes and narrative because it genuinely feels like I just played a whole saga crammed into one entry. There's a lot here, but they didn't have time to tell it. Like seriously, if they were able to actually finish Xenogears and polish up the issues, this would be like a 10 out of 10 game that could never happen again. With experience comes wisdom, and that experience of writing a big story like this made Takahashi and his teams pace themselves. With the lack of experience and not knowing what truly goes into this level of writing, they wanted to tell you everything at once without holding back. But in doing so, it's overwhelming. They don't let you digest anything and let you reflect on what you've played so far. It's just go, go, go. And in turn, that made me appreciate the other Xeno games more. Saga has a way slower story pace, but it's actually paced out enough to fill multiple games, to the point where the first game foreshadows things that don't happen until the third. And with the Xenoblade, it's shocking just how simple the story is by comparison. By pacing themselves and holding back, they were able to tell stories much better. Which ones you like more is subjective, but I never had to look up external materials to understand the general plot in Xenoblade, which is just better storytelling. Xenogears made me go insane at times, but in spite of everything, I'm really glad I played it. While I may not play it again, it's something that I'll never forget. And I mean that in the best way possible. Take care everyone, and I'll see you all next mission.